Howdy, welcome to another week of Cannon Calls. I'm your host, Jake McAtee, and this week we have a special guest all the way from the Netherlands, my friend Hans Offringa. Hans wrote a book about whiskey that I happened upon, and I thought, I got to talk to this guy about whiskey, and he was kind enough to do so. Go check him out. We have links in the show notes to where you can find out more about him and his wife. Before we get started, a book that came to mind as we had this conversation that's on the Canon shelf is called Joy at the End of the Tether, The Inscrutable Wisdom of Ecclesiastes by Douglas Wilson. The book of Ecclesiastes is confusing to many folks who see it as a debate between an untrustworthy nihilist and a genuinely wise man who trust in God instead of giving away to despair. But Pastor Wilson takes issue with that interpretation, arguing that the author of Ecclesiastes is looking at the world with biblically informed vision. Because God is sovereign and will one day judge all men and restore the world, believers can work, rejoice, marry, eat, and worship God in hope. You can get Joy at the End of the Tether today at canonpress.com. So without further ado, meet my friend Hans Offringa. Alrighty, welcome to Cannon Calls. This week, very special guest is my friend Hans Offringa, who I learned about from the Whiskey Field Guide that I purchased. You can find that, I assume, all places. I got it from Amazon and mailed to me. So wherever you get your books, you can find Hans there. Hans, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Hans, can you introduce us to you? Who are you and how did you become the Whiskey Field Guide author?
Well, that's a long story, but I'll start I'll start in the Netherlands. I'm Dutch by origin. After high school, I studied English literature and business journalism. My original intention was to become a teacher in history and English literature, but I also wrote already for the school newspaper and later for a small publishing house in my hometown. And I liked writing so much that I thought maybe I can eke a living out of writing. So I started working at the local publishing company as an editor for some special interest magazines. At the moment I graduated from high school, I got my first glass of whiskey. I was so fascinated by the drink, not only the taste and the aromas, but also the apparent history behind the drink, because it's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And as I would later learn, every whiskey has a story behind it. So after a couple of years, my formative years at the publishing company, I moved to an advertising company as a copywriter and media developer. But in the meantime, I started to sample more and more whiskeys. And in the end, in 1990, I traveled with my best friend to Scotland to find out the source of the whiskey I was then coveting, which was a Glenlivet. And the Scots, they liked that the young guy from the Netherlands was so interested in their national drinks. So they opened up their doors, literally, and gave me a possibility to interview them from a production perspective, from a marketing perspective. And I also do photography, so I could do whole reports on what a distillery actually looked like. And at first, I only used these as prompts for my stories when I returned home. But then I got to like doing photography, so I ended up supplying magazines with my own photography and later on also books, other publishers, fellow writers who needed particular images that I could hand them. So as of 1990, I could blend my profession as a writer with my passion for whiskey. And that's where it all started.
Okay. So can you familiarize us with the whiskey landscape today? Is this a product that's on the rise? Is it coming down? What's going on in terms of the market with whiskey?
Yeah, if you look at what happened in the late 1980s, when most people were drinking vodka and lighter spirits, and they didn't want to associate with their father's drinks anymore. It was the same in the US as in Europe. Bourbon was for old geezers with a cigar in hand and sitting in a Chesterfield. And here in Europe, it was roughly the same. Then Diageo, which is now the biggest player in the field, they introduced 6 single malts called the classic malts from 6 different regions. And that kind of kick-started the growth of Scotch. And it never stopped since 1988. And in its wake, bourbon got rejuvenation and reassessment. And to be frank, I love bourbon as much as I do Scotch and Irish. So bourbon could ride piggyback on the success of Scotch. And the Irish also came back with a vengeance because they always say, we invented whiskey. Whereupon the Scots say, well, we invented the marketing of whiskey. So we've seen an astonishing growth in numbers, not only from the regular distilleries, but when laws were loosened a little bit in the early 2000s, a lot of craft distilleries came to the fore. And whereas if I look at the US, mainly about 95% of all bourbon was made in Kentucky. Now it's made all over the states. Every state, I think apart from Alaska and Hawaii, but I'm not entirely sure, does have its own distilleries. And they make bourbon, they make rye, they make even single malt whiskey. The same happened in Europe. As I said, I'm from the Netherlands originally. We have a traditional gin, and all these gin distillers now turn their hands to whiskey as well. So it's not only booming in sales from the known brands, but also mushrooming of craft distilleries like we've seen 20 odd years ago with the home brewing and the craft brewers.
So I feel like I'm very familiar with sort of the boom in beer craft and everything else, especially it seems like a big thing in the States. Are you saying also that happened with whiskey and bourbon?
Yeah, indeed. And you now see there's some cross-fertilization. You may be familiar with Brown-Forman, who owns Jack Daniel, and they own Woodford Reserve and some other interesting stuff. They recently bought 3 Scottish single malt distilleries, among which Ben Riach, which is well known, and Glenfiddich under the aficionados. But the other way around too, Glenfiddich, which is the largest player on single malt worldwide, they bought Hudson Bourbon, which is located, its distillery in Gardner, New York, upstate. So you see the buying in stretches out throughout the world. If I tell you that Jim Beam is owned by a Japanese company, you might be surprised. That's what happened. The Japanese have built up a very powerful ownership in the whiskey world, and they've been doing that for 30 odd years. And they also make their own single malt whiskey.
Wow. Is there anywhere you've mentioned a few, well, for me, international places. Is there anywhere that's sort of notorious for whiskey consumption? Is there any countries or places that they consume the most whiskey?
Value-wise, the US, and then I concentrate on Scotch, if you allow me for a moment. Value-wise, it's the US, but content-wise, it might not come to your imagination immediately, but that's France, or France, as the Americans say. An American wife, so she corrupts my beautiful British English at high school and later at university. I'm sidetracking here. In France, they consume more whiskey per capita in a month than cognac, brandy in a year.
Wow.
You might know the company Pernod Ricard, French drinks company.
Okay.
They own about 20 distilleries in Scotland, among which Glenlivet, Chivas Regal, you may be familiar with.
Yes.
That. If you look at ownership, most of the distilleries are now part of large international conglomerates. There's only a handful of distilleries still in the hands of the descendants of the founding families. Glenfarclas is an example. Glenfiddich, Springbank has a couple of more.
Wow.
Of course, all the new kids on the block, they either survive or they get picked up by the big boys if they're interesting enough, or they bleed to death because they can't finance the next step in their projected growth.
Yeah. Could we, I'm glad you mentioned that. Could you talk a little bit about that? Let's say if someone owns a reserve, the way that they have to finance those kinds of things. It's always been fascinating to me how people figure out how to do that.
You may know that when you make whiskey, in Europe it's called new make spirit, before it goes into a cask or a barrel. In the US, the term white dog is more common. Then you have to mature it for a couple of years before you can bottle and sell it. So if you start from scratch a new distillery, what you see here is what the new distillers do. They also make rum and vodka and gin because that doesn't have to age. So they have part of their distillate they will put in casks and barrels and let it mature for years and years. And the rest, that'll keep the machine going, their gin, their unaged gin and vodka and rum.
Fascinating.
Of course, the companies who've been around for a long time, like the Glenfiddich, they started in the late 19th century. So they have a long, not only track record, but they could build up large stocks. In the early 80s, before the classic malts were introduced, there was a big whiskey loch, as the Scots called it, because people tended to drink light spirits, and there was an overproduction. There was far too much in the warehouses. So what happened then? Independent brokers came on the market, and they bought up the surplus of casks. And then when the market was booming again, they would sell whiskey that was then much older because it had been maturing in these casks for many years under their own label, but still mentioning on the label from which distillery it came. So you had a whole set of new players. And in the US, you have various independent bottlers like Compass Box. There is One Cask Nation, Joshua Hatton, who is in New Haven, Connecticut. He's world famous for his independent bottlings.
Wow.
He's even made Keeper of the Quaich by the Scots, which is the largest honor the Scottish whiskey industry will give to an individual who has shown exceptional performance in promoting Scotch whiskey in Scotland.
I love that you mentioned the New Haven, Connecticut. I think if somebody had a bingo card for my podcast, New Haven, Connecticut will get mentioned in every single episode. So I don't know why. It's just I don't know. I have no clue. Who would have thought? In terms of the process, could you walk us through a basic whiskey? What is the process that distinguishes itself from other sort of spirits?
Give you a crash course in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
The basics for every whiskey are the same. Whiskey is made from 3 components, and that's a type of grain. You can't make whiskey from grapes or fruit. Clean water and yeast. And that can either be baker's yeast or distiller's yeast or brewer's yeast or your own yeast strain if you keep that alive like a lot of home brewers do. What happens is, if I concentrate on malt whiskey, because bourbon is made from corn, whereas malt whiskey is made from malted barley, there's a little bit of a difference. So I'll concentrate on barley. You have to malt the barley. In each barley corn,
okay,
inside is starch. And if you soak the barley corn into lukewarm water for a couple of days and then spread it on a floor, it starts to germinate. What happens? Enzymes will help converting the starch into soluble sugars. And sugars are very important to make alcohol. So in the end, after some days, you have very full, rich, saturated barley corns. You crush them into a kind of flour. You put the flour in a huge vat, which is called the mash tun. You add lukewarm water, and you stir it like porridge, and then you drain off the sweet water into a separate vessel. And that will go into a new vessel, and you add yeast. What happens then? The yeast will convert the sugary liquid into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide will be given back to the air, and some distilleries even catch it and they sell it to manufacturers of sodas, and they can use it again in their drinks.
Okay.
Now, this first step about mashing and fermenting is very akin to making beer. Only the beer brewer will add hops, whereas the distiller will put that low beer-like fluid. It contains 7 to 9% alcohol. He puts it in a still, a pot still or a column still. Pot still is a batch-oriented process, whereas in a column still you can make continuous 24/7 distillate. By distilling it, what happens is the alcohol fumes will go up through the neck of the still because they're lighter than water, and it will be recondensed into an alcoholic liquid, about 22%. You have to have 40% at least to call it whiskey, so they distill it a second time, usually up to 60, 65%. And then you have a clear liquid, doesn't have any color. All color will come eventually from maturing in a cask. They put the liquid in a cask, dilute it to 63.5%, and then let it mature in a warehouse for a minimum of 3 years. Because if you don't take 3 years, you're not allowed to call it whiskey here in Europe.
Oh, wow.
In the US, it's a little bit different because they use corn and rye and wheat. After 1 day in a cask, you can already call it bourbon. But yeah, but that's not. I wouldn't recommend that. Straight bourbon, which are the big bourbons, they have to comply to a whole set of rules, among which longer maturation and some other rules, which is all described in separate chapters in the field guide. And after maturation, the whiskey will be sampled by the master blender, and when he says it's okay to be bottled, they'll bottle in a batch. That can be 10 years old, 12-year-old. You see a 12-year-old, say Glenlivet, which I mentioned before, that's assembled from casks that were at least 12-year-old. You can have casks with 18-year-old whiskey in it, but you're only allowed to put the youngest age on the label. That's different with rum. If you have a 3-year-old rum and you do 1 teaspoon of 30-year-old rum in it, you're allowed to say this is 30-year-old rum.
Right.
Rum is not that regulated as whiskey.
Would the same principle apply with wine? There's a big sort of reverence for very old wine. Does that same principle apply to whiskeys?
In a way, but wine matures further in the bottle. Once you've bottled whiskey and you have a good closure on it, there's no air coming in or going out. So the whiskey itself won't change anymore. So if I have a 12-year-old whiskey in a bottle, has matured 12 years in a cask. If I put it away for another 10 years and then open it, it's not 22 years old.
Right.
That's a big difference. However, when whiskey matures, yearly, a small percentage of the contents of the cask will evaporate. It's called the angel's share. That's because the wooden casks, they can breathe, and that's important because you have to get air in, because oxidation forms a very important part of maturation. So it takes some of the alcohol fumes out and some of the air in. So over time, it's about 1.5% to 2% of the contents of the cask per year. If you keep a cask for 25 years, you will lose some percentage. And that means what's left, that'll be more costly. And also it has been in a warehouse for 25 years. So took a stock position there, and that adds up to the price too. Now, all the whiskeys are always by a lot of people perceived as better, but I've had 5-year-old whiskeys that were great. Right. And I've had 40-year-old whiskeys that my mouth did this, was so tannic, turned into oak juice. And there's another difference with wine and whiskey. Wine has appellations. The terroir is very important with wine. But Scotch can be made from barley sourced in Canada or in Australia or in England. Scots don't like doing that, England, but the old alliance and all that. But that's also a main difference. In order to call Scottish whiskey Scotch, the barley can come from anywhere in the world, but you have to distill it, mature it, and bottle it in Scotland in order to call it Scotch. If I take a cask out of Scotland, I buy casks on a regular basis, and I take it out of Scotland and bottle it in the Netherlands, I'm not allowed to put Scotch on the bottle.
Wow.
There is a geographic denomination, but it has nothing to do with the barley or the yeast itself. Water, obviously, because you have to make it in Scotland, you will use Scottish water.
So you'll just go buy a cask. That's fascinating. Can you tell me about that?
It started about 12 years ago. No, I'm sampling whiskey for the industry there. So,
okay.
But my wife tastes with me. She's the other half of the whiskey cup. It was a very good taster. So we sample small amounts of whiskey, and then we give our opinion, and then it can be bottled or not. And one time I had the opportunity to buy a cask of Springbank whiskey to go with one of my books. It was a book on whiskey and jazz. They wanted to make a special Springbank jazz edition for the Netherlands, and I was allowed to sample it. And with the help of an importer and liquor stores, because I'm not allowed to sell liquor to a consumer because I don't have a liquor license.
Sure.
What I can do is buy the cask and sell it to another business party.
Okay.
So we did the Springbank whiskey, the jazz edition. Then 2 years later, we did the Springbank blues edition with my book Bourbon and Blues. That started it all. And then our hometown was nominated as the city of taste, the capital of taste in the Netherlands. And they asked if I could source a cask and have it bottled for our hometown, Zwolle in the Netherlands. And I've done that for 12 years now. We source the cask, buy the cask, it's bottled in the Netherlands. We deliver it at the local liquor store. And we launched the whiskey with a little festive party. And people, it's about 300 bottles.
Wow.
People just, and I hand number them. So people, they already sign up for the next year and they want the same bottle number.
Very cool.
That's a nice sideline. It's not my regular business, but it's nice that the industry offers me that opportunity.
Yeah, it's very cool. I want to see if I can get on a list for this kind of opportunity myself. One question that I had, and I think this might be a bourbon question, but I've noticed, and I'm sure you see these, they come out every year with sort of what were the best whiskeys of this year lists online. And I try to pay attention to them, or my dad will send them to me. But what I've noticed maybe in the last few years is that the number one bottle has been bottled in bond. Now, is that a trend, or does that distinction make it taste better? What is bottled in bond?
Good question. And that applies not only to bourbon, but also to whiskey worldwide. When you make whiskey, the excise office, the tax office wants its share. Now, if you picture this, you make 10 million liters a year, like Glenfiddich does. You put it in a cask, and then you have to pay taxes on 10 million. But in 10 years, you will incur the monies for it. So that was not a sustainable business model. It was the same in the US, that the distilleries had huge stocks, and they couldn't sell them yet because they were by law not allowed yet to bottle it. So both in the UK and in the US, people stood up and said to the government, listen, we have to have a bottled in bond act if we can, as long as we don't sell it to the public. And you have a 3-tier system in the US. That's different here. It's a bit easier here to step over one tire. So as long as we don't actually sell it, but we have bottled it, we need a bonded warehouse because it was bonded by the tax office. And that's called bottled in bond.
Wow.
So it could have been in a warehouse for a couple of years already in the bottle. So you know it's a 4-year-old. It won't get older than a 4-year-old. That solves the problem of paying tax over maturing whiskey that you can't sell yet. It's also difficult. You fill the cask, and like I told you, in 20 years, it's a 20-year-old whiskey. You lose 1.5% to 2% per year. And if you have to pay taxes on something that's then got lost, that wouldn't be fair. So the term bottled in bond it's not a connotation of a special quality.
Okay.
It's just, it works better for the industry.
That's fascinating. So do you have any guesses as to why these particular bottled in bonds are making it to the top of the list? Is it just that was a great year, and then with the tax stuff, they had to get it out? Or what's your guess about why they keep making it to the top of the list?
Not many consumers were familiar with the term bottled in bond, but basically it's marketing bullshit.
Okay. All right.
Whether it's bottled in bond or not, whether it's a sour mash whiskey or not, the main thing and the most important thing is, do you like it?
That's good.
And if you like it, you have a good whiskey. And if someone says, oh, you need a 23-year-old Pappy from Winkle, you have to deplete your savings account for it, I would say highly overrated. It's nice, but it's highly overrated. And it's the same with other, like Colonel Taylor's bottled in bond. Great whiskey, there's nothing wrong with it, but I think the price-quality ratio has gone through the roof. You can make, if you create scarcity, and then you start up a whole marketing machine. That's not only the case with whiskey, with all kinds of luxury products. You can really overhype a brand. I'm not very fond of it. Well, I'm an independent writer. I'm not connected to any brand, so I look at it from a very objective point of view.
Sure.
If I do tastings, Becky and I do blind tastings for the international whiskey competitions. We get sets of samples, and we don't know what it is. We just give our notes, and we score these whiskies via a certain method that all the judges worldwide have to use, but we don't know what we're getting. We can recognize stuff because we have a big olfactory library built up over 35 years, but the whole important thing with these international competitions is that the experts don't know what they're tasting.
Can you talk a little bit about Pappy Van Winkle? I feel like maybe that's one of the premier brands that you're speaking of in terms of there's a bit of scarcity and a lot of hype. A lot of people want Pappy. How did that come to be? Are you familiar with their story at all?
Oh, yeah. There's a very interesting book written by, I think, Pappy Van Winkle's granddaughter, and it's worthwhile reading. He was a remarkable man, and he made beautiful whiskey. And when his son took over, and later his grandson, who I know personally, he and I did tastings together in Charleston, South Carolina.
Oh, wow.
I had a lot of talks with him, and he said, well, my father and I could still source from very old stock, beautiful old whiskey, and we had first pick because they don't have a distillery. Pappy Van Winkle used to have the old Stitzel Weller distillery, but that closed, I think it was in the 50s. And now it's owned by Diageo, and they started it up again. They had beautiful old whiskey that Pappy still was involved in making, but they ran out of stock. So now what they buy is from Buffalo Trace, and they have first pick, and it's from a special warehouse. It's still very good whiskey. But I also told him, I said, you artificially make a scarcity and then drive up the price. I said, that's a business model. I don't like it, but who am I? I'm not a distiller or a marketer of whiskey. But that's basically how they do it. I won't say it's not good whiskey. It's a very fine whiskey. But the way it's positioned, you can compare it with a Windows computer or an Apple computer. I was so stupid in 1995. I bought an Apple and I'm hooked to it, and I pay far too much for power. Yeah.
Brand loyalty. Yeah. That's right.
But if you like that and you can spend the money, I would say buy it. There's nothing wrong with it.
Sure. Now, we kind of got into Pappy there. Could you, in the book, you talk about Elijah Craig and Evan Williams and Jack Daniel, John Jameson. Are there other men in the whiskey history that you are especially fond of, whether it's their story, not just their product, but can you tell us a little bit about maybe some of your favorite men in whiskey history?
Definitely, that would be Tommy Dewar.
Okay.
Dewar. He was the first to make a video clip, and it's still on YouTube. You should try and find it. It's a horrible little movie, but it was the first moving picture ad for a whiskey. He was also known for his aphorisms, and he had these witty one-liners he came up with, like, do right and fear no man. Don't write and fear no woman. That kind of, the mind is like a parachute. If you don't open it, it won't work. And he had a whole series of these. They're in a little book called Dewarisms. He was a very funny man, and he was a marketing genius before the term marketing was even around. We're talking about the late 19th century. He was one of the last big whiskey barons of that age. So yeah, I would mention him immediately, but there are more guys like Andrew Usher, who supposedly invented blending at his mother's kitchen table, and that's why we have blended whiskey.
Wow.
There's stories, so many stories to tell, and I try to cover some of these nice stories in a separate section of the field guide, which is called Whiskey Trivia. It's about people, about history, nice to know things. And it's apart from the chapters where I describe how the different kinds of whiskey are made.
It's a very thorough book, and I don't want to give any more away that folks, just listen to this and not buy the book. But one piece of trivia that I wanted to ask you about was, I think this was in the trivia section, but the moonshine's relation to NASCAR. I think this American audience in particular would appreciate that piece of trivia.
Yeah, I'm not gonna read from my own work here, but there's a very distinct connection between the two. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's worth, maybe that part is worth the price of admission there for especially for us on this side of the world. So let's say folks go by the field guide. What would you recommend if somebody listens to this interview and they would like a sort of broad take on whiskey? They kind of want to get more familiar. How would you recommend they go about that process? Do you have any tips?
Well, my tip is always, whether you're a novice or you're very experienced, treat what you have in your glass as if it's your first, because you will have your eyes open, your ears, your mouth, your whole perception of a drink. Also, if you go to a distillery, I've seen professionally 150 distilleries, but I always go in and I put my mind on blank, and I'll say to the tour guide, don't be intimidated. Just treat me as a whiskey tourist and who has never been in a distillery, because I want to hear from you how you perceive your work and how you tell the story how whiskey is made.
I love it. So would you recommend, I mean, you were mentioning the great news now is that we probably have a better shot in 2020 of finding a distillery somewhat close to us than we would have in the past. Is that correct?
Yeah. If you want to first visit to distilleries in the US, I would certainly go to Mount Vernon. That's George Washington's original distillery. It was restored to its former splendor, and you can really see how he made rye whiskey, not bourbon, in the late 18th century. It's marvelously done. And then I would go to Kentucky and at least go to Four Roses, because they have the most interesting story about what they do with yeast. Nobody else does that. You have to learn that. Maker's Mark is a great one to go to. Woodford Reserve in Frankfurt. And when you're there, just continue and go to Buffalo Trace.
Right.
And there's the American Whiskey Trail. There's a Bourbon Whiskey Trail. You can find all about that on the web. There's excellent books about it. American author Susan Riegler, I always call her the Dame of Bourbon. She's been writing about bourbon for many, many years.
Okay.
Chuck Cowdery is a famous bourbon connoisseur, a very outspoken guy. I have a couple of nice books. Fred Minnick, you might have heard of Fred Minnick. He's a drinks writer. He is an interesting guy because he originally was a war reporter. He's been in the Middle East and everything, and he came back, and then he eked out a living as a drinks writer and became well known for writing about whiskey. He's one of the younger authors, the generation that comes. I wouldn't say after me, that sounds so condescending. He's younger than I am.
He's a young guy.
Relatively young.
Okay.
I think he's late 30s, early 40s.
Okay.
And Susan is my age, and she's been around for quite some time. She just, with Peggy No Stevens, who is related to Booker No, who is he doesn't live anymore, but he's one of the big names in bourbon after Prohibition. She wrote together with Susan Riegler and Peggy No, wrote a very nice book about bourbon and food called Which Fork Do I Use with My Bourbon? It's just out, and I can hardly recommend it because the ladies have done a great job. It's full of fun, and they have nice tips how to set up your own bar, arrange your own tasting. So that's one I would recommend.
Okay.
And the field guide it was meant as a primer. If you know nothing about whiskey, it's really good to start with the book, but it's also, and that's my forte, I know that for many years of writing, that I can explain complex things in a way that the layman enjoys reading it, but also the people who know far more about it are still enjoying it. Okay. That's how I set up the book. I wrote a synopsis, I sent it to 5 different people. 2 of them didn't have any connection to the whiskey industry, and 3 of them came out of different areas. They gave me some advice. I made a new synopsis, and then I started writing a first draft of the manuscript, send it to them and say, tell me what you think lacks and what not. And especially the 2 guys who didn't know anything about whiskey, they came with such great advice, because our little group who has been writing about whiskey very long, Charlie McLean, Jim Murray, Dave Broom, myself, we always have to not forget that a lot of people are new to the drink. So these 2 people who were reading my manuscript, they just came back and said, Hans, we don't know anything about whiskey, so we should really pay attention to that too. They were great help in furthering the manuscript. In the end, my publisher, Workman Artisan in New York, did a great job with the book. It's been selling very well, for which, of course, I'm happy. Becky is happy.
Of course.
And she did some work in the background too. A lot of the images in the books are made by ourselves, either by Becky or by me. So we can deliver photography as well. And for a writer, that's not usual.
Right. Well, the quality shows. I thoroughly enjoyed it, Hans. Where can folks, if they hear this and they want to keep up with more of what you're up to, where can we send them?
Oh, I have a mini blog on my Facebook page, and I do funny stuff. We have a Facebook page called The Whiskey Couple, and we do announcements for the industry with new whiskey. And that's connected to our Instagram account, which is also a Whiskey Couple. That's the easiest way to find out what we're doing. Just if you want to be friends with me and I like your face on the no, just kidding. Ask to like and we'll respond. You can send me emails if you have questions. I don't know if you have time, a little more time, because
no,
through email,
please.
I got one of the most interesting experiences in my life as a whiskey writer. I've been writing for the Charleston Mercury for 14 years. I have my own column every fortnight. Now it's every month, but the previous years it was every fortnight I had a column. And they have a large following in the southeastern part of the U.S., mainly the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, Texas, about 65,000 people. I got an email after a couple of years from a lady, very, very lively email. She wanted to know something about an old whiskey she had. And it appeared to be a whiskey that was distilled before Prohibition, bottled during Prohibition as medicinal drink. That was possible. It was a loophole in the law at the time. I said, well, I'm in Europe at the moment. I can't do anything. But when I'm back in the US, I'd love to see the bottle. So she invited me. And then she insisted I open the bottle. Now, this was a lady in her 80s.
Wow.
But I read her email. I thought, she's in her 40s. Very, very sprightly woman. Very lively. And she had invited her son. She knew my publisher in Charleston, so he was there with his wife. And she said, oh, let's open the bottle. I said, well, I don't think we should do that. That's worth a lot. And I don't want to be the one who opens that, and then you'll find out that you can make a lot of money if you want to sell it.
Right.
Because she wasn't really interested in drinking it. She said, no, please open it. We're going to share it. It was a pint. It was about 0.5 liter, the old measures. So I drank it, and it was amazing stuff. It had matured for 15 years, and it was beautiful, full flavored. And then she started to laugh. I said, why do you laugh? Well, she said, I have another case of 24 pints there in the corner.
Whoa.
What had happened, she had been given cases of whiskey from friends, and that was at the end of Prohibition. And there was a lot of whiskey still in bonds because they couldn't move it. So employees of that company were paid in cases of whiskey, a lot of cases of whiskey. And they were given away to friends and family, and they got cases as well. They drank them. And she said, my husband died, and I moved from where we were living then. I think they were living on Cape Cod at the time. I moved to Charleston, where my husband originally came from. And I forgot about that we had another case. And
Wow.
suddenly my son was in our little house in Cape Cod, and he came home and he said, Mom, look what I found. And she said, so I have this whole case, but we're not going to drink it anymore. You're well connected. Would you want to sell it for me? I said, well, that's a friend's favor. I'd be happy to help you, but I don't want to do that on a commission basis or whatever. So, but it might take some time. So I started looking for someone who might be interested in it. And it took me 5 years, and then I found the right buyer here in the Netherlands. And the guy who bought the case, he flew to Charleston. He packed the bottles himself, and he flew back with the case, and he had a special seat next to him where the case with the 24. Now, these bottles now sell for between 2,500 and 3,000 euro a piece. It's amazing.
Wow.
That wonderful story, and I'm still in touch with the family. They didn't want to have their name mentioned. It's a very old, traditional family from the south.
What's your best guess as to what it was?
Oh, it was labeled, so I could see where it came from.
Okay.
And it was one of these companies that was especially founded for handling large stocks of bourbon with a license to sell it as medicinal.
Okay.
And that worked as follows: you had to have a permit for a pharmacy. You would go to your general practitioner. He would write you a recipe. Go to the pharmacy, get your pint.
Right.
And I've been told that many medical doctors did self-medication during Prohibition.
Well, I don't know how I become the guy when someone finds sort of seemingly rare alcohol that they give me a call to come try it and open it. But I'd like to let everybody know I'm open to being that person. You don't have to call Hans to fly him over. You could just call Jake.
But you enjoy drinking whiskey yourself?
I do quite enjoy it. I am a novice at best, but I do enjoy finding stuff that I like. And I meant to ask you, what did you have in your glass? You have a glass currently.
It's a blended malt called the Big Swirl.
Wow, look, that's groovy.
It's from the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, SMWS. That's been around since the early 80s.
Okay.
And it's the society, it buys its own casks, bottles its own product, and only members can sell it. So you have to become a member.
Wow.
And then you have access to their monthly releases. And they do, this is a blended malt. So these are single malts from different distilleries and then blended together, 10-year-old.
Wow.
Beautiful, fruity one. But they also have from the regular distilleries. If you go to smws.com, you can see what they bottled. That's open information. You can only buy it when you're a member, and they'll ship it throughout the.
Wow.
The SMS has a branch in the US.
That's got to be maybe one of the best mail days that you get. Just whiskey is shipped to you. I imagine you get a lot of whiskey shipped to you. Is that true?
People always think I have a house full of whiskey, but we usually get samples, little bottles.
Okay.
I'll show you what it looks like.
You just have a cabinet of samples.
Yeah. Look, this is a.
Oh wow.
This is a specimen. Well, what I usually do, half of it we taste, and then we write our tasting notes and send them to the one who sent it to us. And then I have a little bit left, and the lucky friend who's with me a certain evening who likes whiskey, I will say, here's my sample cabinet. Pick your flavor, because for me, drinking whiskey is sharing experiences with people.
Sure.
I'm not a hoarder. I collect whiskey packagings because I've been doing that for 40 years. So I have I have a little shed in the back of our garden, and there I sit and contemplate. But the walls are adorned with empty packagings, and I can see what Glenlivet did in 40 years with changing the packaging, which is only an example.
That's brilliant.
And then we have some distillers, they find it difficult to ship these little bottles.
Sure.
It costs far too much time, and then send me 0.7, 0.75 bottles sometimes.
Okay.
And that we taste it, and we invite some friends to have a taste with us. So I enjoy whiskey, but I'm not a heavy whiskey drinker. I drink whiskey every day, but not in huge quantities. So I can never finish what the industry gives me, so I better give it to someone else.
I love that. So do you obviously know whiskey very broadly. You mentioned Glenlivet a few times. Would that be your favorite?
Well, it's one of my favorites, and it was one of the first distilleries I visited.
Okay.
My first journey to Scotland was in 1990. My goal was to go to Glenlivet.
Okay.
And so that's one of my prime whiskeys still. It's also a memory. It's the same what I had with bourbon. Four Roses was my first bourbon. I became friends with the master distiller when I wrote Bourbon and Blues. He was my contributing editor, and then he invited me to the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, and I could launch my book at Four Roses Distillery.
That's awesome.
That was in 2012. Then he surprised me. He sent a letter to the governor and asked if I could be named Kentucky Colonel for my work on bourbon. And I was nominated a Kentucky Colonel, and I've been carrying that title for some years.
Nice.
For Dutch country boy.
I love that. The Kentucky Colonel. That's awesome. I got to start running in the circles that you run in, folks that'll surprise you with things and invite you to their distillery. That I got to get into that group of friends.
Where are you based?
So we're in the chimney of Idaho.
In the chimney of Idaho.
I think there's a distillery in Spokane.
There might be. We have family in Seattle. I know that's not too close.
4.5 hours away, though. It's pretty close.
There's Woodinville Whiskey Distillery.
Okay.
That's a nice one too.
Okay. Yeah, it's I have not made it to distillery yet in my life. So I got to get busy. I was supposed to be in Kentucky this summer, and then COVID, the big C, hit the world. So maybe next year.
Well, if you ever need an introduction, let's keep in touch over email.
Yes, please.
I'd be happy to introduce you. And usually distillers like when the writing folk come and see and do reports. They're usually very, very nice.
That would be great. Well, I'd be eager to give him an episode. And Hans, I'd love it if you came back on. We'll find a reason to have you back on. I know you have quite a backlist of books and other things that you write, but maybe we could do a live taste testing. That would be fun.
Yeah, we could certainly do that, and then use something like Zoom or meetings.
Yes.
So people can. I do that occasionally for people here in Europe. I mentioned the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. I'm one of their honorary ambassadors, so I do some stuff on. Now in COVID times, we do it on Zoom. On Zoom. Okay. We have another project called StreamYard or StreamYard, and that's like a virtual studio. So you can have 5 presenters, a host and co-hosts, and they can be on physically different locations. And the primary host, he can decide who's talking and who's being seen. And we've done this with a musician on the Isle of Skye, with a distiller in Glasgow, with a host in Edinburgh, and I was the co-host in the Netherlands. And people, you can broadcast it together over Facebook, over Instagram, YouTube, and people can respond immediately. So you get highly interactive form of television. And so people would ask us questions. So they were the co-makers of the program because they could steer the program in a certain direction if we wanted to, of course, because there's limits to what you want to say, what you can do. But look into that.
Yes.
StreamYard or Stream, I forgot the name.
We absolutely will. You don't have to convince me much to do a a live taste test. That would be a blast, and I'm sure it would be electric radio essentially for folks. We could also maybe do a YouTube, put it on YouTube.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk more about writing in general because, well, whiskey is the main body of my work now, but I've done totally different books, and the writing process itself. I always enjoy talking about that, but I assume you write articles as well. You don't do podcasts only.
I don't do podcasts only. So yes, you would be that episode would be wonderful and fit right in with what we do here. So Hans, we got to get you back on, and it was the Field Guide.
A Field Guide to Whiskey. That's the official title.
Perfect. Awesome. The Field Guide to Whiskey. Go get that on Amazon or wherever you get books.
Available in bookstores, on Amazon. Yeah.
Perfect.
If you want to sign a copy, you have to come currently to the Netherlands because we can't fly to the US at the moment because of COVID.
That's right. Maybe I'll mail mine. Perfect.
Well, what I could do, I could write a little message for you and scan it and then send it via email. You can put it in your book as a bookmark.
That would be awesome.
Shall I use one of my... what I can do if you enjoy that, I'll show you. Now, this is blank. Okay. On the other side, my credentials as a Kentucky Colonel. So if you like to have...
I would love it. No, I'd love it. Send that one. Perfect. Yeah, I've pushed you past your time.
That's okay, but I'm starting to feel a little hungry. It's 6:30 in the evening now.
Perfect. 9:30 here. We finally did it. Thank you so much for your patience, Hans. And everyone, go get his stuff. Appreciate you.
Jake, let's keep in touch. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yes, sir. You got it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.